They were corrupt. All they could see was their way. They no more kept the law. They just required others to keep the law. That's one of the things about self-righteous people. They're generally not nearly so concerned about them being righteous 100% of the time. But boy, they sure want to make sure you are. And they'll spend great energy making sure that everybody knows it when you're not. So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. This is the first and only mention of Paul's family. We don't know much about his family. Now, there are questions here. How is it this kid winds up right where he can hear this plot? How is that possible? Now, we don't know for sure exactly how old this young man was, but we can guess that he was probably a smaller boy. And the reason we can do that is we'll find in just a few minutes that when this boy goes to the commander at the garrison to tell him what he's heard, the commander, seeing him, takes him by the hand, leads him to a private place, and here's what he has to say. It's the action of a protective man to a small boy. So when Paul's sister's son heard of their ambush, he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions to him and said, "Take this young man to the commander, for he has something to tell him." Now, sometimes we don't recognize a miracle because it comes in such a natural way. You know what I mean? We pray and pray and pray about something and ask God to intervene. We ask for healing. We ask for help. We ask for those things. And then when it comes and it looks like everything just worked out, all of a sudden, God doesn't get the credit. We don't see it as a miracle. What caused that boy to be in that place at that time and not to be detected so he can escape and so that he can go and he can speak to Paul and then subsequently to the centurion and the commander? That was a miracle. Right time, right place. Just because something comes to you that seems to have worked out naturally doesn't mean that God's not behind it. Doesn't mean you didn't get your miracle. So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "Paul the prisoner called me to him and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you." Then the commander took him by the hand, went aside, and asked him privately, "What is it that you have to say to me?" If this had been today's time, he might have said, "What is it you have to say to me, son?" And he said, "The Jews have agreed to ask that you bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire more fully about him. But do not yield to them, for more than 40 of them lie in wait for him, men who have bound themselves by an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for the promise from you." Now this is what God has set up in this. He now knows Paul's a Roman. And to allow the Jews to kill him without trial, he would be disciplined for that. Complete violation of Roman law. And not only that, but this boy comes and tells him exactly what the Jews are going to do. And if they call to ask for Paul to come down the next day, he knows it's all true. They set a trap. They're the ones that are caught in the trap. So the commander let the young man depart and commanded him, "Tell no one that you have revealed these things to me." And he called the 2 centurions, saying, "Prepare 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. And provide mounts to set Paul on, and bring him safely to Felix the governor." He wrote a letter in the following manner: "Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and about to be killed by them. Coming with the troops, I rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman and a consummate politician," because you just twisted the facts. He didn't quite tell him the rest of the story. "And when I wanted to know the reason they accused him, I brought him before their council. I found out that he was accused concerning questions of their law, but had nothing charged against him deserving of death or chains. And when it was told me that the Jews lay in wait for the man, I sent him immediately to you, and also commanded his accusers to state before you the charges against him. Farewell." Then the soldiers, as they were commanded, took Paul and brought him night by night to Antipatris. Now the trip from here to the place he was sending him to Felix, it's about 60 miles. And 40 miles of that area is through winding, narrow mountain roads. Perfect place for an ambush. This commander was taking absolutely no chances. 470 troops, the best that the Romans had. And he surrounds this citizen of Rome, and they carry him. Now, this is not too shabby, folks. God is going to send Paul, and boy, does he send him the royal way. He sends him with the favor of the army. He provides him with a complete entourage. He provides him with safety so that the Jews can't possibly touch him. And he gets right straight to the heart of the Roman government for the area. When Paul went to Greece and stood on Mars Hill, he had the opportunity to speak to the scholars. As Paul goes into the major cities, even though things resulted in riot, he had the opportunity to speak to the magistrates and the rulers of the cities. Paul comes to Jerusalem and speaks to the chief commander of the garrison. And now he's being sent to speak to the governor. The next day they left the horsemen to go on with him and returned to the barracks. And when they came to Caesarea and had delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And when the governor had read it, he asked what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear you when your accusers have come." And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. The praetorium, the barracks of the soldier. Now this Felix guy is pretty unique. Felix has a claim to fame that no other Roman governor ever had. That is, that Felix had been a slave. And he is the only slave ever to be freed and later to be appointed as a governor of a Roman province. Felix, his brother, was someone, you talk about the right place at the right time, who had befriended the emperor Nero. And they were big-time buddies. They were friends. And through his good offices and his advocacy, he managed to get Felix his citizenship and to be released as a slave. And then later, through continued advocacy, historians record that he is made the governor. There's something else about Felix that is kind of special. a man named Simon, not Simon Peter, but a man named Simon, who was fully familiar with Christianity and the tenets of the Christian faith, had become a friend of Felix. And they spent a great deal of time together, because there was no TV, talking. And as a result, Felix had come to completely understand about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Felix had some really severe shortcomings. Felix was a crook. And as a matter of fact, at the time that Paul goes to Caesarea, Felix has been governor about 5 years. But only 2 years after this, Felix is involved in a scandal. He had been skimming for quite some time. Felix had a situation where riot had broken out. And not wanting to be accused, he not only crushed the riot, he wiped them out. And he had created such an uproar for what was considered to be his unjust treatment of the Jews in Caesarea that they went to Nero and they complained. Now, remember something I said early in the teaching of the book of Acts. Nero, as Roman emperors go, Nero was actually a pretty good guy, right up until the time that Paul witnesses to him as he is in Rome. And after he hears the gospel, it's as if he becomes possessed. And he begins doing all the terrible things we hear about Nero. The Jews complain to Nero, and Nero responds by relieving Felix of his position. Felix had a huge shortcoming. He couldn't make a decision. It was said of Felix by a historian of the time that he ruled like a slave, and he treated everybody under him the way he had been treated as a slave, and they hated him. So this is an interesting thing about this man. He knows all about Christianity. He's been given a great gift of his citizenship and a Roman governorship, having been a slave. Never happened before. And he chooses to remain a crook. Chapter 24, verse 1. Now, after 5 days, Ananias and the high priest came down with the elders and a certain orator named Tertullus. They brought a slick attorney with them to do their pleading to the governor. This guy, he is so flattering that he makes you want to go take a shot of insulin, whether you're a diabetic or not. Everything's sugar sweet that comes out of this guy's mouth. These gave evidence to the governor against Paul. And when he was called upon, Tertullus began his accusation, saying, "Seeing that through you we enjoy great peace and prosperity is being brought to this nation by your foresight, we accept it always and in all places, most Felix, with all thankfulness. Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us." Does this guy sound like a snake or what? "For we have found this man a plague, a creator of dissension among the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of a sect of the Nazarenes." Now, why would this upset anybody? Do you remember what we said about those men who had come before claiming to be the Messiah? They were always afraid that during the high holy days, that was the time when riot and insurrection would start. What they are accusing him of is being the ringleader of a group that are going to try to cause a rebellion against Rome. That's the accusation. He even tried to profane the temple, and we seized him and wanted to judge him according to our law. But the commander Lysias came by and with great force took him out of our hands. Well, God'd make a good liar. He's a liar. If you'll remember the story from the scripture, they set upon Paul simply because he said salvation was coming to the Gentiles, and they had almost beaten him to death when the soldiers had to wrench him out of their hands to save his life. Lysias didn't attack them with great violence. They were trying to save Paul's life. Commanding his accusers to come to you by examining him yourself, you may ascertain all these things of which we accuse him. And the Jews also ascended, maintaining that these things were so. Then Paul, after the governor had nodded to him to speak, answered, Inasmuch as I know that you have been for many years a judge in this nation, I do more cheerfully answer for myself. Because you may ascertain that it is no more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with anyone, nor inciting the crowd, either in the synagogues or in the city. Paraphrase? These are all guys who were rulers of the Jews. Not one of these guys was there when I was in the temple. Not one of these guys is an eyewitness of what I was doing. All these guys show up making these accusations, and you haven't got a single eyewitness. Not one. Everybody here is all spouting hearsay. Nothing more. Now, nor can they prove the things which they now accuse me. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, which is what Christianity was referred to, Christianity is not used as a term until much, much later. That according to the way which they call a sect, so I worship God, the God of my fathers, believing all things which are written in the law and the prophets. If you recall, every time Paul went to a city and spoke in the synagogues, he simply took the Old Testament and pointed out all of the prophecies that were written concerning the Messiah, and then pointed to Jesus' life on a point-by-point basis, saying, if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it's a duck. He's saying everything it says about the coming Messiah, Jesus' life matches up with that. And I have hope in God, which they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both of the just and the unjust. This being so, I myself strive to have a conscience without offense toward God and men. Now, after many years, I came to bring alms and offerings to my nation. Do you remember that Paul was taking offerings for the poor saints from all the Gentile communities, all the Gentile believers, to bring it back, to bring blessings to them? In the midst of which some Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with a mob nor with tumult. In other words, I was just minding my own business. I was just praying and worshiping. And they saw me and they went ballistic. They ought to have been here before you to object if they had anything against me. How come they didn't bring the eyewitnesses? Or else let those who are here themselves say if they found any wrongdoing in me while I stood before them in the council. Unless it is for this one statement which I cried out, standing among them concerning the resurrection of the dead, I am being judged to you this day. I didn't break any laws. I didn't create a riot. I wasn't making an insurrection against Rome. I simply spoke out to people who didn't believe it because of their denominational status, saying God will raise people from the dead. But when Felix heard these things, having more accurate knowledge of the way, he knew about Christianity. He adjourned the proceedings and said, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will make a decision on your case. So he commanded the centurion to keep Paul and to let him have liberty, and told him not to forbid any of his friends to provide for or to visit him. So he's rather under house arrest, not in prison. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife, Drusilla, which interestingly enough was a daughter of Herod Agrippa I. Remember? He was her daughter. They had an incestuous little mess going there. Who was the wife of Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning his faith in Christ. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. He didn't want to give up his lifestyle. He knew Christianity very well. He had heard about the judgment to come. And when he heard about the judgment that was imminent for him, he knew it was true. And it made him tremble. You know what? Not everybody, when you tell them about Jesus, just turns around and says, no, I choose not to believe Jesus. More often than not, the answer that you get for those who don't make a decision, we'll talk about it later. Let me think about it. That's exactly what Felix did. Meanwhile, he also hoped that money would be given him by Paul, that he might release him. Therefore, he sent for him more often and conversed with him. His goal was greed, Paul's goal, converted. But after 2 years, Porcius Festus succeeded Felix. Yeah, because Felix got nailed for his dishonesty. And Felix, wanting to do the Jews a favor, left Paul bound. Now, this was the great downfall of Felix. He could never make a decision. He could just never be definite. One of the things you learn if you've ever been a leader in your life, there are 2 qualities which you absolutely have to have. And if you don't have these 2 qualities, you will never be successful. Number 1, you must be deliberate and be sure you have all the facts before you put your stamp of approval on anything. Number 2, when all the facts are in, you cannot afford the luxury of not deciding. You must be decisive, and you must stand in the absence of any other information on your decision. If you cannot do that, you cannot lead. And Festus did not possess that ability. Chapter 25. Now when Festus had come to the province after 3 days, he went up to Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest, and this is a different high priest, because the previous one's been assassinated, and the chief of the men of the Jews informed against Paul and petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in wait along the road to kill him. I guess they got a new 40 guys since they couldn't eat or drink. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself was going there shortly. Therefore he said, "Let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there is any fault in him." You know, he's a new governor. He doesn't want any kind of a problem with the Jews. He says, listen, I won't let him go, but I need you to come up to Caesarea so that we can deal with this. And we'll find out what the truth is. And when he had remained among them 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. And when he answered for himself, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. I am not a fomenter of insurrection." But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, "Are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and be judged before me concerning these things?" So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know." Now, here's something interesting about being a Roman citizen. God knew that Paul would be born a Roman citizen. It was part of God's working behind the scenes to set things up. A Roman citizen who is accused of a crime, except for 3 crimes, could always appeal if he felt like he was getting a raw deal by the judge who was dealing with him. And when he appealed to Caesar, that governor was obligated to get that prisoner to Caesar and to make his case right before Caesar, before Nero. Now, Paul being a Jew, an average Joe, never would have gotten an appointment with Nero any other way. It's the only way he could. And God set all this up. Jail. He set all this up with hateful Jews. He set all this up in all his circumstances just to make sure he made it before Nero. Think about your own life. How many times maybe some of the stuff that you went through was to get you where you were? Not everything that happens to you that looks bad on the outside is necessarily bad. Not every conflict is necessarily everything having gone wrong. The reality is, sometimes God set it up. Sometimes there's a reason for it. Sometimes it's to get you where he wants you to be. Paul, the 3 things. If you were convicted of a lower court of murder, rape, or kidnapping, you couldn't appeal to Caesar. And they executed you immediately because the punishment for those crimes was death. Any other accusation, you had the right as a Roman citizen to appeal to Caesar before any sentence is passed, so that he himself could hear your case. So Paul said, "I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know." In other words, and I'm not getting a square deal from you. For if I am an offender, or have committed anything deserving of death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, "You have appealed to Caesar, To Caesar you shall go. And after some days, King Agrippa, and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus had laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me. And when I was in Jerusalem asking for judgment against him, to them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets his accusers face to face, and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charge against him. Therefore, when they had come together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. And when his accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. And what he's saying is, I don't know anything about Jewish things. I'm a new governor here. I don't know anything about their religion. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, and Bernice, the daughter of King Agrippa I, you see, the wife of Festus, and the wife of Agrippa, sisters. Wow, isn't that interesting how that got engineered so that their relationship was close enough where Agrippa would hear the gospel. So the next day when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp,